this is Hua. This is the continuation of Yelena. Please be sure to find the previous parts in the videos on my channel. I hope that you enjoy, and if you have not subscribed yet, please help subscribe and support me and many of the other YouTubers. Thank you so much. Enjoy! Tom cursed at the broken wheel and shook his head. This morning, when he rode from home, it looked fine. Halfway to town, it gave out on him. Now they were stranded, and he had sent his 2 men back home to fetch the second wagon. He was along with Emily, and she was sitting on the ground, twisting her dress with her fingers, obviously bored. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing deeply, finding it hard to believe how his day had turned out. "You're thinking about your luck, aren't you?" Emily asked. "What's it to you?" She shrugged. "Nothing. But I'm sure you're feeling like a fool right now. Why don't you just be quiet and continue twirling your thumbs?" Laughing, she stood up and walked to him. There are certain people in life that make me laugh. People who are so smart in other things but can't seem to figure out the smallest details in life. Those people have me rolling in laughter. He watched her smile, and something about it made his gut feel empty. There were times where he could foretell the future by listening to his guts, but this time it felt burning with a red sign of warning. Before he could utter his thoughts out loud, he felt the pistol at his head. He raised his hands in surrender and watched as Emily's lips turned into a smile. The man holding the gun walked in front of him and smiled as Emily walked to his side. She reached out and held his hand and smiled at Tom. Confused, Tom asked, "Who the hell are you?" The man holding the gun smiled, and he cocked his head. "Is that any way to greet your brother?" Tom felt as if he'd been kicked and left breathless. Brother? Did he just say that? He narrowed his eyes and stared at the older man's face. His eyes held a familiar gaze, and he watched as Emily turned his face toward him and kissed him deeply. When they pulled apart, Tom shook his head in surprise. "Brother? How the hell can you be my brother?" Tom asked. The man laughed. "Oh, if only we had grown up together, I have a feeling we'd be thick as thieves. But there are some things that can't be undone, like that whore of your mother." Tom tightened his hands into a fist at his sides. He watched as the man lowered his gun, put it in his holster, and looked up at him. "Don't you dare talk about my mother. Don't you dare threaten me, brother. You're the scum of the earth compared to me. Your dirty mother had to sneak her way into my father's life by tempting him with her slutty looks. She was the reason why he left my mother." "What are you talking about? My mother was raped. I was born from a rapist." He laughed and shook his head unbelieving. "Is that what she told you? Is that the sad story your mother told you?" "Oh my, you don't know anything, do you? You're just a lost, scared little boy who's been chasing a ghost all these years." "Well, let me tell you something. That ghost you have been chasing, that ghost is me. I'm the one who took your mother's last breath. I'm the one whose hands are covered in her blood. Your search is over, brother. So why don't you get on over here and give me a great big brotherly hug?" The anger he felt exploded, and he charged forward with fists connecting the other man's jaw. They both landed on the ground with Tom pounding his fists into the other's face. He saw the image of his mother lying in a pool of blood, and he wanted to tear this man apart. He heard Emily's cry and plea for him to stop, but he couldn't control himself. He wanted blood. He hungered for it. "Stop it!" Emily cried. "Do it, brother! Kill me!" he cried, with blood gurgling out of his mouth. Tom grabbed his collars and pulled him into a standing position. He was breathing hard. Sweat covered his face, and his knuckles bloody from punching. "What is your name?" "Edwin. Edwin Ryan." Staring at Edwin's face, Tom felt the heated anger wash over him. This was the man who gave the thumbs up for the other man to kill his mother. This was the man who was behind the torture that killed his mother. He wanted to rip his head off. It was a good thing his hands were bound behind him. Otherwise, there would be bloodshed. He watched as the man who called himself brother attended to some meeting behind closed doors, leaving him with Emily. She was sitting with her legs crossed and examining her fingers. She was a liar, and he hated liars. When she finally caught his eyes looking at her, she smiled and lowered her fingers. "Are you still tender about what happened?" she asked. "I could kill you right now." She smiled and stood up. "But you won't, will you? I know you way too well by now, Tom. You'd never touch a woman against her will. It's your mother's last dying wish for you not to." "Don't you dare talk about my mother." She walked to him and touched his cheek. He jerked away from her. She smiled and lowered her lip to his ear. "If only you had listened to me and let me into your bed, none of this would have happened. I was rooting for you, Tom, I was. But all you saw was Yelena. And because of you, Yelena will have to pay. You leave her alone. I can't do that. By now, she's a liability. And what do we do with liabilities? We get rid of them. Actually, you should thank yourself. You brought this upon her. First, you killed her father, and now you're killing her. Boy, aren't you a busy, busy, busy little bee." "Did you have anything to do with her father's death?" Emily narrowed her eyes. "What do you think?" "Of course I did. I hate Yelena. I would do anything to make her feel as rotten as me. It's not fair that I get to live the crappy life while she gets to live the royal life. We both grew up in the same household." He frowned. "What do you mean, household?" She smiled and sighed deeply as she sat down again. "We're sisters." Tom leaned forward, not sure he was hearing her correctly. "What?" "Yes, we're sisters. Well, you see, before her father decided he was too good for my own mother while he had her in his bed, my mother was a prostitute, and his family name just couldn't be smeared with that kind of woman. My mother was 2 months pregnant with me when he kicked her out of the house. And then he married that good-for-nothing woman and had Yelena. Do you think he ever stopped to think about me? No. Even after my mother begged and cried on her knees to him about me, he still refused to let me in. He didn't take his responsibility as a man." Tom swallowed hard. "What does that have to do with her? She's innocent in this mess." "Perhaps, but she still has to pay. She grew up well while I had to suffer at the hands of the men my mother called lovers. Do you not know the cruelty I've been through? She deserves to suffer. And who are you to decide who is to suffer and who is to not? Who made you God?" Tom asked with disgust. She laughed. "Why, I did, of course. I made the one possible to give everyone who went against me the ultimate price to pay. And because you decided I wasn't good enough, you're going to have to pay too. How did you hook up with him?" She smiled and leaned back in her chair. "Well, he's been looking for you for years while you were looking for him. It's like a dog chasing its own tail." "What are you talking about?" She walked to kneel down in front of him. "Don't you know? I'm the one who told him everything you were going to do. I'm the reason you're looking like a damn fool right now." Tom's breath caught in his chest and his vision blurred. He felt distorted as she chuckled softly and stared at her fingers. The strength in his hands became more powerful than he imagined, and he ripped the ropes off of him. Emily's cry was silenced as he grabbed her by the throat and smashed her against the wall. She was filled with shock as his eyes were filled with deep rage. She choked and brought her hands to try to pry his fingers from her throat. "You will now feel my wrath as my mother did when she was killed," he said. Edwin was looking over maps when Tom entered the room. His men were the first to take notice, and he turned to their gazes as to what had caught their attention. When he saw Tom, he straightened and shoved the maps away and smiled. "I underestimated you, brother," he said. Tom gave a sneer. "You should." "Where's Emily? Did she run off scared to death?" "I'm afraid Emily won't be doing any running from now on." His face paled, and he rushed past Tom to the room where he had kept. His face paled, and he rushed past Tom to the room where he had been kept. When he found Emily on the ground, still and eyes open to nothing, he let out a howl. Tom waited until he came out before he threw a fist to his jaw. Edwin tumbled over, and he bent over, taking the gun from his lip. He pointed it to his men and cocked it. "If you want to die, come on," Tom said. The men raised their hands and stepped back. "My fight here is with him alone, not with you. If you value your life, you'll leave here and never return. If I see you anywhere in the future, I'll shoot you on point." The four men, whose eyes were filled with questions of whether to stay or go, stared at each other and then at their boss on the ground. Finally, the first one walked out and the rest followed. Tom turned his gaze to Edwin, who was lying on the ground with a bloody lip. "You and I have a lot to discuss," he said. "What do you want?" Yelena asked. Her head was pounding from where she had been hit. She saw that Nettie was standing before her, gagged and hands tied behind her back. Adam was pointing a gun to her head, a smile on his face. Adam smiled. "It's so simple, really, Yelena. I want you. If you go with me quietly, I'll let her go. If you make a fuss, I'll show you how much blood can flow from one little bullet wound." She tried not to let it show that she was shaking. Okay. Let her go, and I'll go with you." "I thought so." Yelena watched as they untied Nettie and shoved her to the kitchen floor. When he took her, she didn't give a fight. She turned and watched Nettie as she was led out of the house to the carriage waiting outside. Her heart was pounding. Her legs were like noodle, and no matter how she tried to paint an escape plan, it came up blank. She got into the carriage and watched as the house faded from her sight. When she turned her gaze to Adam, he was smiling, sitting comfortably in his seat, as if it was a routine that he did daily. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Yelena, why do I get the feeling that you hate me?" he asked. "It's not a feeling. It's the truth. If you're smart, you'll let me go before he finds you." Adam smiled and shifted in his seat. "You mean Tom? He's not going to be finding you anytime soon. Right about now, he's tied up, and I mean literally." Yelena swallowed the fear that he meant what he was saying. She hadn't heard from Tom all day, and going to town wasn't supposed to take that long. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, don't worry. You'll get to meet him soon enough, dear. That is, if he survives Edwin first." "I saw your photos with Emily." She smiled. "Oh, did you? She's quite the spark, isn't she? But too bad that she's not as innocent as you. You see, a man with my image, I need someone pure and untainted. That's where you come in. If the town sees me with you on my arms, they'll value me as a good, decent man and give me more votes. In no time, I'll rule over the county. I'll get all the money from any charity I want and use it for myself." Yelena felt sick as she listened to him. "You're supposed to help fix our community, not steal from the good of the people." "Everyone steals, darling. It's a matter of life and death. I'm sorry to break it to you, but it's just part of life. Just like your father." Her head shot up at the mention of her dad. "What about my father?" "He was a pebble. What do you think we do with pebbles?" "You killed him?" "I was doing a job Emily asked me to do." She felt her whole world come crashing down. She sat up and tears filled her eyes. "What are you talking about?" He leaned forward on his knees and laced his fingers together. "You see, darling, the truth is, you and Emily are sisters. Your father isn't as innocent as you think he is. His little snake wandered from town to town until he found Emily's mother. And if he hadn't been so stuck on living the high life, perhaps you'd be happier. But he just couldn't live with the fact that Emily's mother was a whore. So he found your mom and had you. And poor little Emily grew up without a father and in turn found me, who was able to give her the peace when I took out your dad." Yelena started to cry and she lunged forward, clawing at him. He caught her by the wrists and pulled her down and she screamed out at him. He laughed, licking her cheek, holding her close to him. She fought him and pushed him off. "You murderer!" she cried. "I was doing my job, darling. When you see Emily, you can kill her if you want to." "I'll kill the both of you," she cried. Adam laughed. "I sure am looking forward to it." The carriage came to a halt outside an old cabin at midnight. Adam pushed Yelena out and she took off running until he caught her by the waist and hoisted her over his shoulder. She screamed as her lungs gave out as he walked up the stairs. He kicked open the door and set her down on her feet. She turned to find the cabin empty. He frowned and looked around, probably surprised as to the emptiness. She took off again, and this time he pulled out his gun and fired a shot in the air. She screamed and fell to the ground with her hands covering her ears. "If you try that again, I'll murder you right here," he warned. She looked past him at the pair of legs sticking out from the room. He followed her gaze and cursed. He walked toward the room, and she walked with him, only to find the still body of Emily. Adam dropped to the ground, picked up the body, and shook her, but she remained as still as she was before. Yelena turned and found a broken chair and some ropes. She picked up the rope, turned it over in her hands. Adam was bawling at the loss of Emily. She couldn't care less as she tried to figure out what was going on. The house looked like it had been an escape plan for them at some point. She walked to the front door and saw the maps on the table. She turned them over and saw that there were lands that were waiting to be bought. Frowning, she saw that one of the lands to be bought was the land her father built their inn on. What was going on? Still frowning, she was caught off guard when Adam returned and grabbed her arm, turning her around. He took one of the maps on the table and shoved her away. "Go wait in the carriage," he ordered. "No, I'm not your prisoner. I don't have to do as you order." He slapped her hard across the face. "Go now before I gut you." As she turned to go, they both heard the gunshot from behind the cabin. Adam bolted out the back and she followed. It was dark, and she couldn't see anything. Twice she tripped and felt her skin break from the ground. She couldn't see where Adam had gone, and now she wished she stayed inside because she lost track of where she was going. "Adam?" she called out. There was no answer. She heard the sound of crickets and running water. The moon up above showed little light, and she was beginning to worry about what might be waiting for her in the dark shadows. Shivering, she tried to circle back to where she had begun, but ended up deeper into the thickness of the forest. Before long, she came upon the river she had heard. She dropped to her knees, scooped up a handful of water, and drank. When she finished, she stood up and a hand covered her mouth, dragged her into the forest. Yelena kicked and swung her arms, but whoever held her wouldn't let go. She finally took a bite out of his hand, and he dropped her to the ground. As she scrambled back up, he picked her and turned her around. "It's me, Tom," he whispered. She threw her arms around him, never happier than now to see him. "I was so worried about you." But then she pulled away suddenly. "Wait, what are you doing here?" "Oh my God, it's a long story. I'll tell you later. For now, be quiet." She looked around and turned back to him. "Where did you come from?" Without answering her, he took her hand. "Let's go." Yelena followed as he led her back toward another part of the forest. They crossed over a few logs, and she tripped, but this time he caught her before her knees touched the ground. In the light of the moon, his eyes stared at her, and she felt his hands on her arms grow hot. Seriously, she thought, in this moment, while being lost in the forest, you're thinking about this? She looked away, and the moment was lost. He must have picked up on her vibe because he continued to lead her without looking at her or touching her again. The cabin came into view a few moments later, and she saw the sheriff arguing with the governor. She frowned and crouched down beside Tom, their knees touching. She watched as Adam threw a fist that connected with his jaw and left. Adam stood there for several moments and then followed him. The carriage drove away a few moments later. Tom sighed deeply beside her and stood up, helping her out. "What was the sheriff doing there?" she asked. Tom stilled and turned toward her. "The sheriff?" "Yeah, Edwin is the town sheriff." "He's a murderer." Yelena took his arm. "Wait, what is going on? What happened to you? How did you end up here with—" Her voice trailed off, remembering what Emily was to her. She walked to sit down, and he took a seat beside her. "I found out Emily was my sister." "I know." She looked at him. "Wait, how did you know?" He sighed long and deep. "Because the sheriff is my brother." "Oh my God, what?" Yelena sat and listened as he told the story. She felt angry, cheated, and betrayed. Emily was supposed to be her sister, yet she was one who had killed her father. Edwin was supposed to be Tom's brother, yet it was his hands that his mother died at. At the end, she felt as if this world had no peace. She put her hands over her ears and shook her head when he finished. He reached over and gently took her hands away. She started crying, the hurt, the pain, and the lies colliding with her at full force. I never used to believe that cruelty existed. I was raised in such an innocent place. Now everywhere I look, all I see is blood and pain. When will this end? Will I ever feel peace again? She asked. He took her into his arms and held her. Yelena, I'm so sorry. I wanted to protect you from this. I didn't want you to know anything about this side of life. She pushed away from him. But it exists, doesn't it? I'm afraid so, sweetheart. She sobbed and leaned into him. She could smell his musky scent, and it comforted him. His hands were at the side of her waist, and her fingers were deep inside his shirt. She could feel his flesh pulsing beneath her fingers. She looked up at him, and he took that as an invite because he kissed her. The world around her turned hazy, and she felt as if she was swimming in a pool of fire. It burned, yet she welcomed him with open arms. He pulled away from her and nibbled her ears. You don't know what you do to me, Yelena. When I am near you, I forget everything, and all I want is you. You make me forget the bad man I've become. She shivered against him as he turned toward her and crushed her against him. She could feel his heart beating against her hands. I'm scared of how all this is going to feel. Don't be, sweetheart. I promise you it'll feel good. She shook her head. No, I can't. I need to know that I mean more to you than just a roll in the sack. What am I saying? He laughed and took her hand and guided it to his heart. Do you feel that, sweetie? Do you feel how fast that is beating? It's because of you. Do you know how much I want you? Each time I see your face, all I want to do is kiss you until you beg to be taken. Slowly, he stood up and pulled her to stand. You're going to make me go crazy, he whispered. But I can't do this to you here. I want your first time to be special. I want you to remember it forever. I don't want you to forget how I first made you mine. Bobby and Two-Face came back for them a little after midnight, and they all rode home. Before going back home, Tom came clean that he was the one who killed Emily. She hardly broke a sweat when he mentioned that. For all she knew, Emily had done something to make him kill her. She was the one responsible for killing Yelena's father, so she felt revenge had been served. On the ride back home, she rode behind Tom and kept both arms around his waist. She hadn't had much to think about what had really unfolded that evening, but she knew that things had changed. She knew now that her heart was in a place where only Tom could reach. But she wasn't sure what was in his heart. Was it the same as hers? Could she trust him? He was, after all, a rebel who went with the wind. Could she allow him into her life, knowing that he may one day leave? Would she be able to pick up the pieces and continue if she were to wake up and find herself alone? Tears filled her eyes, and she leaned into him, already knowing the answer. It would be the hardest decision for her to make, because she would be giving him a part of herself. This part he would take with him, and she would never get it back. As much as she knew the risk, she knew she would give it because she was in love. There, she finally said it. She was in love with Tom Hardy, a man who ran with the wind. He caught her heart and held it in his hands. She knew that if he gave her what he truly wanted, she'd accept it without question. Did that mean she was desperate? She didn't know what she wanted at the moment. She didn't know what she was either. But she only knew that if he took her to his bed, she would go. When they arrived at the house, all the lights were on and Nettie was sitting on the front porch. The first thing Yelena did was rush to hug her. The thought of her in danger had scared her to the core. After food and a bath, Yelena couldn't stand the silence anymore and went in search of Tom. She found him sitting outside staring at the midnight sky. He had lit a fire beside him, and she wasn't sure if he welcomed her, but she took the chance. He heard her and turned to look at her. "You're not sleeping?" he asked. She shook her head. "Can I join you?" He patted the space beside him. "You can always join me." She sat down and he pulled her close to him. "I was looking for you." "Yeah, I know. I needed to think about everything." She was silent. "I've been searching for answers since my mother died," he continued talking, "and now that I have them, I'm not sure I like them very much." She ran her hand over his. "I'm sorry. I thought if I just knew the answers, it would solve everything in my life. But sometimes what you think you know, and what you wish to find out are very different. I'm trying to remember what really unfolded with my mother, and I'm having trouble believing that things didn't really happen the way that I thought it did." Yelena turned his face toward her. "Tom, don't let what Edwin say change anything. What you know is the truth. He's the one who hurt you and took everything away. He'll try to make you alter your thoughts just because he can. Don't let his words change anything about how you feel for your mom." He smiled, touched. "You're right. My father's image was shifted too. But the truth is, I don't believe anything anyone else says, because I lived and grew up with him, and I know that although they may have been hurt by what he didn't do, I know for a fact that he loved me. That's what is going to keep me from having second thoughts. He died, and he died loving me. I'm sorry that he caused Emily pain, but it doesn't make what she did forgivable." Tom leaned down and captured her lips. "You're so good, you know that?" She gently pushed him away and looked up at him with heavily hooded eyes. "Tom, I need to know something." "What is it?" She forced herself to say the words. "Do you love me?" He stared at her and then turned away. She took that as her answer and stood to go, but he stopped her. He caught her chin and tilted her face up to look at him. For a moment there, I thought it was the governor that you loved." Yelena laughed. "What? I could never love a man like that. He's not you." The look on his face showed her everything that she needed to know. That's all I needed to hear. "But you haven't answered me." He smiled. "Does it matter?" She thought it over and knew that it didn't because she was willing to give him anything. "No." "Liar." Yelena looked up surprised. "What?" He smiled. "You're too good to not want me to love you first." "You think I didn't know all your thoughts on the ride home? I could hear you bickering inside that mind of yours. I couldn't help but smile." She got up to go, but he pulled her back down and held her against his arms. "You're teasing me." Laughing, Tom said, "No, that's not teasing. This is teasing." With that, he bit her ear. She was caught off guard, but loved how it felt. He turned her around and caught her lips. He made love to her that way for a long time. When he was done, he pulled back and stared at her with eyes filled with lust. The fire made the look in his eyes glow, and it tugged at her heart. "Tom, she whispered. He fingered her cheek. "Say it, lass. Say it." "I want you." He smiled. "Then you shall have me." Thank you for joining me. Stay tuned for the final part.